Okay, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, it's just gone 5, so I think we'll get going. My name's Warwick Mansell, freelance education journalist, also the BERA press officer for this conference, so I'm here to chair the event. We've got a fairly conventional sort of BBC question time panel discussion event, basically, and we haven't had huge numbers of questions in, I've got to say, but I'm hoping for lots of interesting questions from you in the audience. And so I think without further ado, we'll get started. We'll just do you've got some descriptions of the speakers in your pack. So I'll just do very brief introductions, and then we'll seek to get some questions, if that's okay. So going left to right, I have Dame Alison Peacock on my left. She's head teacher of the Wroxham School in Hertfordshire, which is transformed really, took over I see here in January 2003 when it was in special measures, has led it to 3 successful, outstanding inspection verdicts from Ofsted. She's also co-author of Creating Learning Without Limits, a book published in 2012, which explores an alternative improvement agenda, identifying key dispositions for school leadership where every child and adult is valued and where no one is labelled by so-called ability. So welcome, Alison. We've got Peter Mortimer here, who I'm sure a lot of you will know, the former director of the IOE, also one of 2 former BERA presidents we have here, author recently of Education Under Siege, and a London teacher in the 1960s and 70s, and former ILIA Director of Research and Statistics. And to my right, I have Sam Friedman, you also might be very familiar with, very active on Twitter. Sam's Director of Research, Evaluation and Impact at Teach First. From 2009 to February 2013, he was an advisor to Michael Gove. After the 2010 election, he worked as a senior policy advisor in the DfE, focusing particularly on structural reform, funding and teacher training. Prior to working in Whitehall, Sam was the head of education at Policy Exchange, where he wrote reports on a wide variety of issues. And finally, Pamela Munn is an internationally renowned researcher and former dean of the Moray House School of Education at the University of Edinburgh. Her main research interests are in behaviour management in schools, curriculum policy and values education. And she's also another former BERA president and a member of the Academy of Social Sciences. So without further ado, I think I'm just going to, first off, just ask for some questions from the audience, I think. So if you could just put up your hands. I hope we've got roving microphones. So yeah. Any first takers?
Takes a bit of time.
Yeah.
Hello. For those of us in teacher education, particularly in England, can you give us any reasons to be cheerful?
Should we start with Sam?
Reasons to be cheerful. Share the microphone. I think the next few years are going to be pretty tricky for everyone working in teacher education. I think the big decision that this government and the next government are going to have to take is what to do about School Direct. School Direct had 15,000 places this year. If that kind of the pace of growth that it's been going on over the last few years continues, then we're going to have to see a very major transformation of the teacher education sector, with a number of courses already have closed, but other courses closing as well as a result. Some universities have picked up on School Direct much faster than others and with much greater enthusiasm than others, and we could see a domination of that market by a smaller number of players. So I think for some universities that will actually be quite positive. They will grow as a result of the shift to School Direct. But for others, it will. Sorry, I'll try to speak into the microphone. But for others, it will be much tougher. But I think there's just a lot of uncertainty at the moment because we don't know which direction School Direct is going to go in, which is going to drive what happens to the rest of the sector.
Okay. Pamela, I know you served on the on BERA's RSA inquiry into this area, so it'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, I come from that far-off country that's recently had a referendum and where the system of teacher education is still firmly university-led, although there's quite a lot of scope for improvement in the area of partnerships between universities and schools. I would say that the sector in England needs to be really fleet of foot in being clear and convincing about what added value it brings to the education of teachers. And I think it needs not to be shy about singing about that, really having a good, well-orchestrated message to get across to politicians. And in the BERA RSA inquiry, about which there's a spotlight session tomorrow at 1 o'clock from 2:30, you'll hear more about what we believed and have research evidence to illustrate about is the important role of a research base in initial teacher education and indeed in CPD and higher degrees too. So my message is be really clear about what you bring that's distinctive. Think also about links between initial teacher education, induction, CPD and higher degrees, and working with schools to try and develop this self-improving system that the inquiry aims for.
Alison, you've got experience of this from another angle, I think, as a teaching school, is that right? Head of a teaching school.
Yes, I would always want to find reasons to be cheerful because essentially I'm an optimist, but I think probably teacher education at the moment is in a difficult place. I think where it's possible to create good, fruitful, meaningful, equally balanced relationships with teaching schools, then obviously that's the optimum. So, you know, in our school we work very closely with the University of Hertfordshire, with the University of Nottingham. We highly value what colleagues from those universities bring that we don't have, and so together I feel we can balance off each other's skills. I think it's about recognising the direction of travel, rather than kind of digging in and saying, well, it's always been this way, we're staying as we are, to try and work with colleagues to find how we can navigate the new landscape in a way that makes sure that we get the best possible quality. And one of my worries about teacher training being more school-based is that where the school is a fine school and where colleagues within the school are very reflective and have time and can work closely with teacher candidates, then obviously, you know, that's one way that works very well. But perhaps if we grow it too quickly, we'll find teacher candidates going into schools where perhaps there isn't that scope to support. So it's a difficult landscape at the moment, I would say.
Peter.
Yeah, just briefly to add, like Alison, I don't want to become a grumpy old man. So I try and look on the positive side, although one does get a feeling of things going round, and we're going back to Joseph Lancaster and the monitorial system when pupils and teachers change from one to the other in one simple move. When I was here, the partnership was first begun, and we had some terrific partnerships with schools doing the bits that they're so good at, and us and my colleagues here, who were fantastic, had been highly successful head teachers or senior teachers, and then came on to the university, often did a PhD, increased their knowledge. They were able to contribute the rest, the theory of learning, the pedagogy and its developments, the understanding research, these really essential points. Now, that can happen in schools, of course it can, but the economy of scale is ludicrous. It's incredibly expensive to have people who really understand those issues and deal with them. So what do? Do you dig in, as Alison suggests we shouldn't, and try and resist it, or do you go along with it and try and convert it? I'm not sure. But don't get too depressed. Whatever happens, or everything is lost. You've got to find the best way of tackling it.
Thank you. I mean, Sam, I just wondered, do you think, with sort of after 10 years, within 10 years, that the landscape in this field will be totally dominated by a school-based provision? As sometimes you get the impression reading things from the National College, for example, that this is going to be the case. Do you think that is going to happen?
I think that's what the current government would move towards, yes. I think the current thinking is moving towards a system that is dominated by School Direct as a model. But I think they are also realising that they have to be quite careful because there have been issues around recruitment through School Direct. And if they move too fast, as they probably already have done, that could actually create an even bigger teacher recruitment crisis than we already have. And I think we are moving into a time when we do have, in certain subjects, it's getting quite bad again. So I think they're probably a bit more cautious than they were a year or two ago, but still with the aim in mind of having a school-based training system, yeah.
Can I ask the question, how confident are you, or do you see any reasons for optimism at all at the moment? No.
Sorry.
Okay. Right, do we have any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you. My question is 8 years old, and it was the first question I ever had when I came into education, studying the whole field, discipline, whatever you want to call it, the arena of activity. And it's, do you think that the machinery of education, broadly understood, is becoming less complicated or more complicated? Because it seems to me that the egos of adults involved in the educational machinery have a role to play, which is stopping change and benefit happening and getting to children. So it's a question about, is it possible for educationists, educational machinery, to step out of the way of us benefiting children? And is that the way that we're heading? Is that the way things are going forward? Or is it getting more complicated and sophisticated and egotistical from an adult perspective?
Right. Could you just explain a bit more what you mean by educational machinery?
Everything that organises, and I appreciate a great deal of organisation is required in terms of understanding how schools might function, how teachers might be trained, how policy might trickle down or have impact, and all of it, the research, everything. Is it becoming more adult-focused or more child-focused?
Is it getting in the way of the child's learning experience? Right, Peter, would you like to?
Yeah, well, I'd say both. I mean, in some ways, what's happening to learning is fantastic. A friend of mine who had a television set and couldn't get it to work rang John Lewis, and in desperation they said, well, it's going to cost you a lot of money if we send someone out. Haven't you got a grandchild? And the way kids have taken to technology, the way they've just mastered it is fantastic and has all sorts of lessons, I think, for us in education. You know, when we formally teach, it sometimes can create great problems. We should be looking at this very carefully. So from that point of view, the learning, I think, is fantastic. The other thing to say is that teaching, I have seen such fantastic teachers in England. I'm going in 2 days' time back to Norway for a presentation there. And what I will say there is simply this. The best teaching I have seen anywhere has actually been in, well, the UK, let me say that. The most muddled system I know is the English system. And so in terms of everything getting more complicated, I'm with you. Just the number of different schools, the different powers that schools have, the different amount of resources that they have, I think is a disaster in terms of a society and a system. But the teaching, despite all of this, the teaching and the learning is very exciting. And if you throw in developments in technology and throw in perhaps neuroscience, perhaps coming up with clues as to how we learn much more effectively, then it's very exciting. So my answer is both.
Sam, do you think it's getting too complicated, the system? We've got lots of different types of schools now, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way it's getting less complicated, in a way it's getting more complicated. I think there are bits of the system that are sort of at a central level being devolved back down to schools, which creates both opportunities, I think, for schools to get more child-centred, but also does mean that you have less overall coordination of a system So I suppose in some respects you might actually want some quite complicated machinery, because if you don't have that machinery, then you might get some fragmentation in the system. But the bit of the system which really isn't working properly at the moment, and I know Warwick has been saying this for a very long time, is around around accountability. I think we haven't yet worked out how to we badly need it. Schools need to be held accountable, but doing that in a way that doesn't create such perversities in the system that we drive teachers and leaders away from what is in the best interest of the child. So that's the bit where I think there is probably, because I agree with Peter, we do have, I think, some of the best teaching. I've seen fantastic improvements in teaching even while I've been working in education. But that is constantly driving people away from what they think is the best thing to do. So I think that's probably the area where we need to focus on getting the machinery better in order to deal with this sort of thing behind your question.
Alison.
Okay, I think it's very complicated. When I reflect on my own personal teaching career, I can see that actually even when I was in NQT, I was kind of subverting the system to try and do what I felt was right for the children I was working with. And I've sort of carried on doing that. And now, as the head of a teaching school, I still feel I'm subverting the system. And in fact, even when I got my damehood, I thought they probably don't really know who I am. But, I was grateful anyway. Because I do think the most important thing is that we listen to children and we understand children. And when we've got a system that is driving us towards things like IQ tests for 4-year-olds in reception classes because it's about school performance, rather than a debate about what might that do to children if those results go home, then I think things have gone too far in the favour of trying to meet the demands of the accountability regime. So I think it's complicated, it's difficult. I used to think that, when I was a classroom teacher, I used to think if you could just shut me in the room with the Secretary of State for Education, whoever it was, I'd be able to sort it out. I'd be able to talk to them and then I'd be able to make them understand and then everything would be all right. Well, I've tried that now with several Secretaries of State and it isn't as easy as that. So, but I think also just to say that quite often when I speak at quite a few conferences, and quite often people will say to me, oh, it was really refreshing, Alison, to hear you talk about children, as if normally when we go out we do anything but, and I think that's very sad.
Pamela.
I mean, I agree with most of what's been said, particularly the need to get accountability systems right, because they do drive a lot of what teachers do day to day in their practice. Couple of things. There have been attempts with different degrees of success to focus on children, in the kinds of classrooms that we've been hearing about, but also the system has tried to encourage that through involving young people in making decisions about what happens in school. And we've recently seen in Scotland 16 and 17-year-olds, I know they're not children, but turn out in huge numbers to vote in the referendum. And that has, schools have played a very big part in that, through the history and modern studies curriculum, in engaging young people in debate about things that really, really matter to them. So I think there are these things going on. I think education is bigger than schools as well. We need to remember that. And there's a lot of good work going on in youth work, detached youth work, community development, all these kinds of areas, which I think it's easy for us sometimes to forget is also part of this big system where rather different norms and values and relationships obtain.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see how the Scottish referendum experience feeds back into education, as you say. It'll be very interesting to watch. Do we have any further questions? Yeah,
I wonder if you'd like to comment, following the IOE report, on vertical contracting in academy chains and similar, on the prudential and moral wisdom of vertical contracting of services?
Again, sorry, can I just get you to spell out exactly what that means a bit?
Well, it's very well, academy chains buy services from within their own organisation, and so they're vertically constructed an economy, and that economy, it seems to me, diverts a great deal of public money into private hands, and I want to know how prudential that is in the first instance, and how moral it is in the second.
Sure. This was a report I think came out last week from IOE Research for the Education Select Committee, looking at private relationships with academy trusts and whether there are conflicts of interest and that sort of thing. Who would like to kick off? Peter?
Well, I just read in the newspaper the report from here about it, and I'll be careful how I say it, but I think it was the Academy's Education Trust, wasn't it, that was cited as having invested a huge amount of money in its own people, and their own families and companies were involved, and it just read awful that it was real corruption, a conflict of interest, complete conflict of interest. But I'm not surprised if you set up a system as loose as that. I mean, all this talk about accountability of teachers, but the accountability of some of the providers seems to be greatly missing. And if you set up a system as loose as that, people aren't stupid, people will do it, and they will make money. And that is the worst thing that we could have, an education system driven by money, rather than, as Alison said, driven by children's learning. So I'm not surprised, I'm shocked by the report that came out. I thought the authors were rather kind, actually, in terms of talking about there might be a conflict of interest. Well, the page, it leapt off the page at you that there was a big conflict of interest.
The government does say that oversight has increased with academies as opposed to local authority schools. So that's the line that often comes back. But
how can that be, when the one is democratically elected and the other are people making money?
Alison?
I didn't read the report, so I can't comment on the report. All I would say is that our school is an academy. We became an academy, standalone academy, when we were also a teaching school, and that was because my chair of governors was very keen that at the time it looked as if there was going to be a tide of primary schools being kind of coerced to become academies, and his view was we need to be at the forefront rather than following on. In fact, from our point of view as a teaching school, I don't think being an academy has changed things very much. We're just one school. I was at a meeting last week where John Cole said to me, how have you got away with just being one school, Alison? I said, I don't know. They've left me alone so far. Maybe this is the end now. They've noticed. I've spoken to you and someone will say. In terms of processes and making sure that everything's transparent, we've actually had 2 full audits in the last year, because you may well know that the Education Committee challenged the notion that academies account through the academic year as opposed to the fiscal year. And so we were an academy that was chosen to have 2 audits, one at Christmas and one at Easter. So there's been quite a lot of scrutiny of our school, is all I could say, but clearly there's room for things to go wrong, which is obviously what you're talking about.
Pamela?
Well, again, I'm sorry, Jim, I haven't read the report, but of course there are Nolan principles of ethical conduct when you're in a public body and governing, and like Peter, as soon as something becomes, a public service becomes an issue for profit, then there is worry. So all I would say is, we had a system of local authorities across the UK, or library boards, which had, not everything was perfect by any means, but had established systems for dealing with wrongdoing. And it seems that we're having to reinvent these, which seems odd.
Sam?
I haven't read the actual report. I remember discussing this issue quite a lot when I was in the department. I mean, I think it is a problem, but it's also not a particularly difficult problem to fix. You just stop allowing academy chains to do that. And in fact, most academy chains don't do that. There are examples, some of which I saw the newspaper reports about the report, some of which were cited there. And it's quite easy to stop. You just don't allow those kinds of contracts to be entered into by academy trusts. There are very strict audit requirements around academy trusts, so it'd be very easy to pick that kind of thing up in future. And I'd be a bit cautious about seeing the system that existed before under local authorities as something that meant you didn't get this kind of problem. I mean, you don't need to read that many reports about children's services that are coming out at the moment to know that having a local authority doesn't create a safeguard around accountability for any system. So you will always have problems under any structure. Nothing will eliminate that.
Isn't there a problem with policing this system, though? Because that seems to be coming out, it's certainly come out from the Public Accounts Committee's reports and the Select Committee as well, that, it's all very well, even if you have rules, there's a difficulty around oversight of academies in terms of keeping up with the number of organisations that are involved now. And I think there's a couple of reports that talked about the government relying on whistleblowers coming forward. So, I mean, is the oversight there of this system that needs to be?
I think, there aren't many systems that couldn't do with some better oversight, but I think in most of the cases that I've seen cited, the department and the Education Funding Agency will have known that contract existed and will have agreed that contract could exist in the first place, because because academies aren't legally allowed to make profit. Where those agreements were set up, they were done so on the basis that they wouldn't make a profit, so the department had to sign off on all of them, so it would have known about every single case. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to define what profit is. So those agreements can still lead to people being enriched, even if it doesn't lead to profit to shareholders. So I just think that problem is just easy to solve. You just don't allow that type of contract. There aren't that many academy chains that would affect.
Sorry, I'm going to ask one more subsidiary question. Sam, do you think that profit making will be allowed by the Conservatives under the next? If they get in the next election?
No. I mean, I heard Nick Gibb rule it out the other day pretty categorically. I think there's very little to be gained from it and a hell of a lot to lose, both in terms of the system itself and politically, even if you weren't interested in the effects it would have on the system. I think they've actually moved against it quite strongly over the course of this Parliament, and it's extremely unlikely to happen under any government.
Yeah, okay. Right,
Let us be grateful for small mercies.
Well, I only asked the question really because Nicky Morgan seemed to be leaving the door open again a couple of weeks ago, which was quite surprising given that they'd seemed to beforehand be...
I think Nick Gibb kicked it closed again pretty quickly.
Right.
So.
Okay. We had one here, and then I think... we're taking one at a time, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. The professional voice seems to be somewhat marginalised in the current system, the current policy regime. And I'm very curious that you think that, Sam, that these things might not happen. But so many things have happened at the hands of authoritarian politicians who have an insistence, have their way with the education system. And I think it's a huge worry where we have all witnessed forced academisation, and as a consequence of that, the idea of failing schools, a huge amount of teacher disquiet, discontent, disillusionment, disaffection, ultimately teachers leaving the system, resignation, and teachers just leaching out of the system. So I think it's really important that we actually have the discussions about democratic schooling and the democratic deficit that seems to mark the English system of education.
Would you have a specific question for the panel then?
The role of the professional voice, the role of academic research, the role of teacher research that actually informs professional decision making, which should take precedence above and beyond politicians who are intent on privatisation, marketisation, and the dismantling of the state system of schooling.
So how do we get a greater involvement of the profession in policy making?
Well, the question is, how does one support and mentor the professional voice when it's clearly being marginalised by authoritarian
Okay.
politicians?
All right. Thanks very much. Peter,
Yeah, well, just on the first point about teachers' unions, I was a patron of the single teachers' union for many years. I've just been reading Fred Jarvis's memoir, and in which he actually makes the case again for a single union. And I do think this is a really culpable issue in English education, that we have so many unions jostling for power and position, and any smart Secretary of State runs rings around them and sets one against the other, divides and rules. So I think it would help enormously if the unions came together. They nearly did when Eamon O'Kane was alive and Stephen was alive. They nearly came together, but both men died and they lost the opportunity, and that was a real tragedy, I think, for English education. If there was one union and one voice of professionals in education, Secretary of State would have to talk more, they would have to debate more, instead of which, by smart politicking, they can follow every whim they have, and they have done that.
Okay. Pamela.
I mean, obviously, I agree with that. I think the trouble, though, is that unions inherently want to do the best for their members. I know that is not a trouble, but they can be seen as small c conservative. I think there's also a place for a professional body. I mean, I'm thinking in Scotland we've got the General Teaching Council for Scotland that acts as an independent body. It has union representatives on it as well as lots of other kinds of representatives. Independent, funded by subscription. You have to register with the General Teaching Council to be able to teach in schools in Scotland. So whether the teacher college is going to evolve into something like that, I don't have a sense of. But it seems to me there's definite space for a professional body like that, in addition to unions and other interest groups in education.
Mm-hmm. Alison?
Yes, I'm a great advocate for a potential Royal College of Teaching, and I've written about that and been involved in the commission that the PTI set up. There's pretty much universal agreement, actually, unusually, amongst the profession in terms of unions and subject associations, politicians. Where we're missing a trick, actually, is the teacher in the classroom, because teachers in classrooms remember the GTC as it was in England, and they don't remember it fondly. So there's a job of work to be done around persuading teachers in classrooms that the notion of coming together with some kind of body that's representative of the profession, that's not a unionised body, but is about promoting the best values, promoting research, providing a career path for teachers so that you could move possibly to the status of becoming a fellow of teaching, recognising the ambition that is within many of our best teachers, within many of our teachers actually, to really make a difference, to have their voice heard. At the moment there is a real vacuum, and particularly I would say in terms of primary education. You know, many of you may know that I was involved for several years with Robin Alexander trying to disseminate the findings of the Cambridge Primary Review. And a lot of what motivated that work and has subsequently led into the work I do now as a teaching school lead and on the Teaching School Council is about trying to enable head teachers to reimagine what it's like to work in primary education, because very often we've got so bowed down with the accountability agenda that to think about things like engaging in research feels as if it's a luxury rather than an absolute necessity, which of course I would believe it is. So a Royal College of Teaching, in my view, could be a way forward.
Just press you a bit on that a bit more. I mean, I wonder, do you think there really is an appetite in the teaching profession at the moment for something like this, in that, you sort of touched on this in your answer, but perhaps that professionalism, I mean, a lot of people would argue, has been undermined out there in schools over the last 10, 20 years, and are people so worried now about sort of their own schools, their own institutions' future, their own performance, that they actually they're not so interested anymore in getting involved with something that's talking about deeper issues of professionalism?
Well, that is the problem. And one of the things that I've suggested is that a Royal College of Teaching could be the body that appoints the Chief Inspector of Schools. You know, if you had a Chief Inspector of Schools who was accountable to the Royal College of Teaching, then you could have a completely different conversation around self-regulation, self-improvement, how we enable the profession to be, you know, in a sense, self-improving in the real sense. Because the problem, it seems to me, with the current debate around a self-improving system is that it feels as if it's kind of running along parallel to the Ofsted regime that says, well, only if you behave yourself in our terms. And somehow we need to bring the two together, because I think the argument about accountability and the need for accountability has absolutely been won. But people, I think at the moment, feel that the current system has gone too far. I mean, anecdotally, I went to get my hair done a couple of weeks ago, and my hairdresser, out of nowhere, said to me, don't you think Ofsted have gone a bit far? And I think if your hairdresser starts noticing, then there definitely is a problem. So.
Wasn't Margaret Thatcher's hairdresser influential in the national curriculum? Maybe this is a new thing.
I resent the comparison. Anyway.
Sam.
I mean, I agree with the need for a professional body, and I also agree that unions are incredibly weak at the moment. I think historically, at the weakest they've probably ever been. I found it astonishing when working in the department how little influence they were able to have, not in terms of direct influence on policymakers, but influence in the system as a whole.
It's not just in education, of course.
And not just in education.
Generally weak.
I think one of the sort of things behind the question is that sort of politicians interfere too much in education, and there's often this sort of cry to get politicians out of education. I think that's A, never going to happen, and B, would be undemocratic in itself. But we do need some clarity about what politicians' role in education is, and I think that's really lacking in education, where it's much stronger in other areas of policy. For instance, I don't think politicians should ever be involved in anything to do with pedagogical decisions in schools. And you'd never get a health secretary who would be saying, this is how you do a hip operation. That would just never happen. Yet we did have a situation a couple of weeks ago where, for a brief period at least, it looked like setting was going to be mandated for all schools. I mean, that should just be something that no politician can go anywhere near. So I think we need to be very clear about what politicians can and can't be, what is the responsibility of central government and what isn't. But we definitely need a professional body to take up some of the stuff that we take away from politicians under that. The Ofsted idea is an interesting one, but also, you know, constructing a professional development system would be much more appropriate for that kind of body than central government. So I think it's getting clarity around what politicians' role actually is crucial.
Can I just come back? Certainly I welcome Sam's comments there on the limitations of the role of politicians. Add to that curriculum as well. Don't let them near the curriculum, especially the history curriculum. But what I wanted to come back on was the unions, because most of my fellow panellists have been pretty anti-unions. I mean, unions are full of problems, of course, but they represent the people who are in the classrooms, who are doing the work. When I was in earlier, I had huge rows with the unions, but nevertheless, they have to be there. And teachers are members of them. It's interesting, Pamela says unions are losing influence. They are losing influence in our society. Why? Because their numbers are going down. Are they going down in teaching? No, they're not. It's one of the highest unionized professions that there is. Teachers can be lonely. Teachers can be an adult amongst a lot of children. Teachers can perform in public. They need support. That's why there's such support for their unions. That's why they are members of their unions. They'd be frightened not to be. And not to use that power, not to use that strength, seems to me a pity. Of course you don't agree with everything the teacher unions want to say, and governments shouldn't. They should robustly argue and negotiate with them. But to pretend they're not there, or to look for other bodies and try and persuade people to sign up to other bodies, seems to me a false avenue.
I think there's space for both. I think, there's obviously a need to have unions, and they provide an important role, although I think under their current leadership, some of them aren't providing the role they should be.
Sure.
But I think a professional body can do something very different. Again, I don't want to, medicine and education are different in many ways, but you can have a strong union like the BMA and strong professional associations, and they can do quite different things in the system.
Okay. Thanks very much, Sam. I should actually say Sam's got to leave early. I'm afraid at 6 o'clock because he's literally going for running on a fun run, a 10k fun run later on for charity for Teach First. So he's got to run. I should have said that at the start. Next question. I think we had one here.
Thank you. This is a question from the convener and co-conveners of the Special Interest Group, Educational Research and Policy Making. So the background to the question. The previous government invested heavily in research into how evidence-informed practice in education could become the norm. And there's lots of organisations taking this forward at the moment in a very disconnected way. So here's the question for the panel. Does the panel think it would be possible for the UK education community to come together to create the equivalent of the Health Services NICE, National Institute for Clinical Excellence and Health, something or other, so that we collectively as professionals take responsibility for providing advice about effective practice rather than be subject to the ideology of the government of the day? And just as an aside, we don't want you to get caught up on whether there's only going to be one way recommended, because we know what controversies can be highlighted in this kind of advice so the professional can take their own decision. So there's the question. Do you think it would be possible for us to have a NICE type organisation in education? If your answer is no, why not? If the answer is yes, how do we make this happen?
Okay.
Thank you.
Pamela?
Well, first of all, I have to keep waving the flag for Scotland here. NICE doesn't operate in Scotland. We have our own body. I don't think there's any chance of getting a UK body, because the devolved parliaments all have responsibility for education services and they guard these very jealously. So I think a UK system is a non-starter myself. On the question of should we be able to get together and provide the equivalent of a Scottish, English, Northern Irish and Welsh kind of repository? I think it's very difficult because universities are in competition with each other for funding, for research funding of various kinds. That's one reason. Secondly, there is seldom unanimity amongst us about not only what counts as evidence, but what the evidence is saying. And so I think there would be rather it would be difficult to bring that together. I think what we're seeing increasingly is think tanks who have an expressed ideological position and who use evidence to put forward their own ideological position. And I see these proliferating. So I think it's a nice idea, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Alison?
I think social media is having a part to play in terms of enabling people to engage with new ideas. So speaking as a head teacher, I think probably this is the first time in my career that you might routinely meet other colleagues from schools and they would talk about research as part of what they discuss. That is the first time I can remember that ever happening. So there is an appetite for exploring evidence and finding out what works, and I think, as I say, social media is part of that. In England, of course, we have the Sutton Trust and the Education Endowment Fund, and I think the danger potentially with that is that you kind of get a sort of top 10 hitters of these are the things that do and do not work, plus minus, let's not bother asking any more questions. And actually it's asking big questions that ought to be at the heart of any research agenda. So the idea of some way of making sure that research remains a topic of hot conversation is good, but it's not simple, obviously.
Sam?
I'm not sure we'd want something equivalent to NICE exactly, because of the differences between education research, the limitations of education research as compared with medical research. I wouldn't want to give any one body that much power in making decisions about interventions, given that the limitations we all know. However, I think it is a very important agenda getting the profession more engaged in using evidence. I think the EEF have helped, and at least we do now have an institution that has a sizable budget commissioning studies. But actually, one of the most exciting days I've had in terms of education over the last few months has been going to the Research Ed conference, which I'm sure a number of you have heard about, which was organised by teachers and is the sort of first occasion really where I've seen a lot of classroom practitioners mixing with academics, with other researchers, and it just sort of felt like the beginning of a movement, I guess. It's a small beginning. It's 1,000 people out of a profession of 500,000. But it does feel, as Alison says, like something is starting to change. As that bottom-up movement progresses, we will need to start putting more of an institutional infrastructure around that. But I wouldn't want to put too much power into one body.
Okay. Who haven't we heard? Can we just hear from Peter and then I'll come to you?
Yeah, I mean, two ways of looking at it. I thought actually there was a centre here as part of the Institute charged with carrying out systematic evaluations of research. Isn't there one here still? It certainly used to be. Anne Oakley started it based on the Cochrane Review, which was a medical initiative at Cambridge, systematically looking at all the literature and coming up with a finding for practitioners. So there's that. Certainly, when I was here, the students, the part-time master students who would be grappling with the day work in the classroom and evening, it was fantastic atmosphere for creative thinking and ideas. Research can be serendipitous. In fact, the best research, often the best medical research, has been serendipitous. It hasn't been planned in that way. So like Sam, I wouldn't want to have a NICE with its complete control. NICE is important in medics because of the cost of drugs is so great, they have to have a body looking for value for money. But we don't have that in quite the same way. So I would want some freedom, but I would hope that the centre here would have been better known and people would have drawn on it, practitioners would have drawn on it.
Okay. Sorry, you had a contribution here. Did you?
What? Oh, press that one. Okay, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, I'm sitting down and asking you questions. This is a question about teachers. They happen to be important in my view. So, what's happening to them at the moment? Peter talked about the unions, teacher unions not ever being united to be able to either negotiate with the government or provide good protection for teachers and be critical friends to teachers. So what I find in my experience of working with schools is they don't want to protect teachers. So I often wonder, does every teacher matter? And if the teacher matters, what does the teacher need to do to fend off the almost daily scrutiny and severe scrutiny to the point of hire and fire is happening in our schools in front of our eyes, not in simple direct way of firing, but making your life so miserable that you have to leave. Now that's what's happening in many of our state schools.
So you're saying somebody needs to stand up for the classroom teacher against management sometimes?
So does every teacher matter? And related to that question is the question of professionalism.
Okay.
Where should the teacher draw his professionalism from?
Okay.
From
I
the
think we're going to have
guidance
to.
of Ofsted or the need of the pupils?
Okay, I think we're going to have to try and narrow the question down a little bit in terms of, as I say, I think you're talking about professionalism and the voice of the classroom teacher, I suppose, in terms of the pressures that some of them are feeling. How do people feel about that as a phenomenon?
Well, I mean, clearly teachers matter, and despite what Peter says, I am in favour of unions. And where there is bullying, workplace bullying, unfair dismissal, of course, the union should be a very important point of call for teachers, and we've heard that teachers are still heavily unionised. In terms of wider issues of professionalism, that's the kind of thing, professional standards, professional values, professional actions, that's the kind of thing that a professional body would be the kind of focal point for, it seems to me, and could be arguing backwards and forwards about what these professional standards are.
I'm going to ask, does anybody here think that head teachers have too much power in our system now? Alison?
Do I think head teachers have got too much power? I was going to answer your question by saying I think that who looks after teachers, head teachers should look after teachers, and it's also quite a difficult job being a head teacher. I was recently at a conference where I shared quite openly the experience I had before my last Ofsted inspection, and that was that I didn't know Ofsted were going to be coming to our school, but there was a chance that they might. And I woke up in the night and I'd got pains in my chest, and I remember lying in bed and thinking, well, at least if I die in the night, I won't have failed an Ofsted. Well, I just think it's funny. I didn't, I wasn't ill after all, but the whole notion though that you could actually lie there and think that, and this is that's desperate, because there are a lot of schools that are far more vulnerable than my school was at that time. So there is a real sense of fear in the system, and I think that fear sometimes leads head teachers to behave in a way to their staff that perhaps they wish they didn't have to. I'm not condoning that at all, because I do think where we can support our heads, they can then support their staff. And when you can support your staff can then support your children. When you've got teachers under pressure, teachers who feel unhappy, teachers who are worried about losing their jobs, it's not a happy place for the children to be in those classrooms either. So clearly something has to give, and I think we've referred to this earlier on. So essentially, every teacher does matter. It's very rare, I think, that I meet a child where I think all hope is lost. And it's also very rare that I meet a teacher where I think all hope is lost. But sometimes, when I took over the school that I went to when it was in special measures, every member of staff stayed until we became outstanding, bar one. And the teacher that didn't stay was a teacher who didn't like children. So it's not every teacher in that sense, but they're very much in the minority.
Peter?
Yes, I think there is, in our society, I think there is a general problem still of a lack of respect for teachers. I think people just don't rate the job sufficiently. They compare it to much older jobs like medicine and law and accountancy and things, and they find it wanting, which I think is terribly wrong, a grave mistake. I think teaching is a fantastically difficult job, but there is that feeling that people in the higher echelons of society don't really value teaching in that way. Good that the government before last made people like Alison dames. They actually introduced that and raised the esteem. That's terrific. But still, when the chips are down, you get the feeling that they don't really trust teachers to do things. They want to bring in other people. Part of the reason for this, I think, is journalists. I'm sorry, but I think journalists too frequently underestimate the role of teachers and how challenging it is. They do their job and they work hard, etc., but they can do it themselves with dignity and privacy. Teachers can't. They're in public all the time in the most demanding way. And I think that comes across, especially London journalists, sometimes it comes across a sort of rather patronising, condescending air about teaching. On the whole, I've been very impressed with leadership, certainly in this country. But the question, I think there is a worry that actually heads, when all the accountability, or so much of the accountability has gone, that some heads will then get themselves into deep trouble, as they do. When I was AEO for secondary schools in Ilia, there were 120 secondary schools, and I had many, many dealings with those 120 head teachers, mostly superb, but occasionally, really, something went badly wrong, but we were able to step in and protect the school, protect that person themselves, because there was the mechanisms there for it. Without those mechanisms, there are dangers, and it's not surprising that every now and then a head goes down the wrong way.
Okay. Sam?
Thank you. I'm going to head off after this, so thank you very much for having me on the panel. We did some research at Teach First last year on what makes the school. We work with about 700 schools. What makes one of those the outstanding schools amongst those 700 outstanding? And it's pretty clear that it's that they work with their staff. It's the professional development systems in the school. It's the mentoring available to teachers within the school. Unfortunately, there just aren't very many schools that do that very well yet. And I think that's partly because we haven't built those skills up in schools and we haven't been focused enough on building those skills up in schools, but also because, as Alison said, Ofsted has become so dominant that the Ofsted framework has become a substitute for professional development in far too many schools. And I've been personally arguing for most of this year quite strenuously that we need to move away from Ofsted giving ratings to teachers, and recently they have said that they will start moving away from giving ratings to individual teachers, which is a good step in the right direction away from that. But I think that's probably where I am on that. So on that note, I'm going to say goodbye.
Thanks very much, Sam, and good luck with the run.
Thank you very much. I'm dreading that a lot more than this.
Okay. Moving on, I think there was a question at the back, actually, a while back, so yeah.
There's one on the left as well.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the panel to please tell me one change you would like to make to initial teacher training. So, for example, trainees have got to pass the skills test, literacy and numeracy skills test, before embarking on ITT. So, what's one change would you make to initial teacher training? Thank you.
Nice and simple, right? Pamela.
As far as initial teacher education is concerned, I would like to see much better formulated partnerships between schools and universities, where there is a shared conceptual understanding about the kinds of experiences that student teachers have on placement, and how that relates to what happens in the university, where there are these different providers. I think there's a lot of goodwill around between schools and universities, but I could be wrong, but I don't sense a deep conceptual understanding of how what happens in practice and school placement relates to university experiences and how the two feed off each other. So I would like to see that really, really developed.
Do you not feel that's improved over the last, 10, 20 years? I mean,
I think it has, but I think there's still a long way to go.
Okay. Alison?
Can I have anything I want? Okay, so when I speak to colleagues who work in HEIs, who lead teacher education courses, they very often say that they feel there isn't enough time and that you can only just scratch the surface. So you might have one day on diversity, for example, and then that's it. That's all you've got time to do. I wonder whether if it could be a 2-year course, with the second year being in your first, your newly qualified teacher placement, but where you continue to have contact with an HEI, where you could actually really embrace some of the issues that are coming forward.
I was going to say exactly the same. Yes, a 2-year course, the first year based on what we do now, but then blending in to professional training. There is so much to learn when you start off as a teacher about your subject. You think you know it, but when you start teaching it, of course, you realize how little you know. You think you know about children, but when you realize the complexity of pupils' special educational needs and how to motivate young people, all those things, there is so much to learn. So I, like Alison, would have a tapered program, hands-on, right in the university I would start off with, but then moving out into the schools, keeping the links, and actually only getting your official qualification after the 2 years.
Okay. What about the questioner? Do you have anything you'd ask for?
It's just the way things are going now. There's a projection out there that in the next couple of years there'll be a shortage of maths teachers in the northwest of England because of things like skills tests, literacy tests, and things like that. It is hindering those who would genuinely want to come into the profession. So we are getting that, and we're going to go back to a couple of years where we couldn't find mathematics teachers in the northwest of the country. That's one issue, and the other issue is it's a put-off. Skills test is a put-off to people who genuinely want to teach, in terms of I mean, you do a driving test, you learn how to drive and everything, you do the test, you pass, and then the next day, your hands are crossed over. You're just doing all the negative things again.
Sure.
So that's just my own perception to all this, to the pressures put on HEIs.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. There was somebody over here.
Do you mean the higher education sector as far as education faculties and schools and so on are concerned?
No, I was hoping you could all broaden it out so that we could talk about higher education as a kind of sector to some extent, away from teacher education, the school sector.
Right. Well, if I could do it in two parts then. As far as schools of education, faculties of education are concerned, I think there's still an issue of a possible kind of bifurcation of the workforce between teacher educators who come up through, as Peter was talking about, good school experience and who are expert practitioners, and those who come through a more conventional academic route as first degree, second degree, postdoc, etc. And we're seeing a lot of teaching-only contracts, for example, which I personally think is very, very unhealthy. So I think there's an issue about how you integrate people with different roles in education faculties so that they're all scholarly and contributing to thinking about teacher education. And I've got ideas about how you would do that. So that's one area. I think the problems facing higher education generally are, of course, those of finance. Across the board, you have the demand for research productivity, student satisfaction on teaching, a concern for student well-being, all very, very worthy, but having to be pursued under quite restricted budgets, where the amount of money given by the government or the income coming to universities direct from government sources is declining. So I think finance is a big issue there.
Okay. Peter.
Yeah, thanks. Well, money is the biggest challenge, I think. In our society, in England certainly, we've got ourselves in a peculiar position where we expect 50% of our young people to go on to higher education, and now that is incredibly expensive, and they're leaving with huge debts, if you take into account living as well as the tuition, huge debts at a time when many of them aren't going to be able to pay off those debts, let alone have a mortgage or pension or any of those things. So a major problem there. And yet coupled with it is our snobbishness in our society about vocational education and about people who haven't been to university, about all the manual jobs. Now, in Norway and Denmark, which I visit a lot, they've avoided both of those things. There are still no fees. People go free, they get a grant for their higher education, and in their societies there's very little snobbishness about those jobs. Now, we've got ourselves in a right muddle. How we get out of it, I don't know, but certainly it seems to me that those societies are much healthier, much more equal than ours, and they're heading in the right way. Ours, I fear, is heading more and more unequally, as Danny Dorling will be telling us tomorrow morning.
Alison, I know you're not directly involved with it with HE, but do you have any thoughts?
I do think that academics are incredibly sexy, actually. I just do think that the whole notion of...
You're onto a winner there.
the idea of being a lead thinker and really immersing yourself in learning and being an expert in something and wanting to share that and having a passion for your subject, you know, I think that we don't always give, well, we don't give enough recognition in this society to what it means to be actually what we should see as being at the pinnacle of the whole learning profession that we're part of. We should have our young children and our young people aspiring to, you know, great heights in terms of their own understanding, knowledge, inquiry, finding out, lifelong learning. So my sense would be that I don't think we value our universities enough. I don't think that we have enough investment in our universities. And yet, without the kinds of thinkers that we have within this country, we wouldn't have achieved half of what we have achieved. And we know, you know, when you talk to organisations like the CBI, they're very clear that they want young people leaving schools, not like robots, but they want young people leaving schools who have an entrepreneurial edge, who can think about things differently, who can be divergent thinkers, and some of whom would go on to be academics. So something about investment, something about society's view. Maybe if we valued academics more, we'd value teachers more, and we'd value children more, maybe. Told you I was an optimist.
Thanks, Alan. It's like personal intervention for me there, but yeah, it does strike me as strange over the last couple of years to watch people such as Michael Gove and Sir Michael Wilshire who talk about the importance of academic study in schools, and yet seem quite happy to, you know, denigrate people working in universities who, as you say, should be seen as the pinnacle of that system. It's just very odd, I think. But anyway, sorry, getting on my soapbox there. I've got a few. We've actually got. I feel duty bound really to call on somebody who's submitted a question because we've only actually had one submitted. So I probably should. Is Sean Hayes here at all? Yeah. Would you like to? Can you remember your question? Would you like me to read it out or? Okay.
Thank you. Is it on? Yeah? Okay. I mean, I work in London local authorities as sort of researcher and statistician, have done for a long time. People may well have noticed that there's been a transformational shift in educational outcomes for primary and secondary school children in London over the last 10 years. Is it on?
Say again.
Yeah? Okay. Sorry, what did I just say? Okay, yeah? Okay, I'm Sean. I work mainly in London local authorities in research and stats role, working with schools over the last 15 years. And in the last 10 years, there's been a transformational shift in educational outcomes in London, whereby outcomes at 11 and 16 are now better in London than they are in the rest of England, and that's comparable across all English regions. They're better in London and for all levels of advantage and disadvantage of pupils. I'm wondering what the panels might think are some of the reasons behind the relative success of London over the last decade.
Okay. Alison?
Well, it's hotly debated, isn't it? And everybody wants to take the credit. I think it was interesting that a report came out not too long ago, certainly this year, that pointed to the improvement in primary education, which then fed through into secondary education. So the work that Kevin Collins and others did with the National Literacy Trust was really interesting. So pointing to the fact that if we get it right in primary, it helps in secondary. She would say that, wouldn't she? I also think the leadership of people like Tim Brighouse, you know, inspirational leaders who enable people to believe in themselves, who collaborate, to work together, they're really important, I think. Another thing, of course, is the location of London and the fact that we had an organisation like Teach First coming to London. Young graduates are much more likely to gravitate to a city like this than perhaps they will go somewhere perhaps less interesting, maybe. It's a very complex issue, but I think I would choose to take from it the fact that when schools trust each other, learn together, engage in peer review, have professional learning at the heart, involve families, and that was another crucial thing, that families were pushing for change and that schools were responding to that, and have good leadership, inspirational leadership, then wonderful things can happen. I would always say that we can make things better. And of course, the magic bullet will be, can we learn from the London Challenge and make it, you know, England-wide challenge? Tristram Hunt was talking about that, wasn't he, just this weekend? Seems to me there's not a quick fix, though. It does have to have all of those factors involved.
Okay, please, yeah.
Three things. Like Alison, I'd say Tim did a great job in the London Challenge. He and all his colleagues provided tremendous support and encouragement and motivation, and the primary people were really part of that. So that's the first thing, and you need that to start it off. But secondly, I have to say money. London schools actually get better money than other schools around the country, and that money helped them create a culture of improvement. And that's the key. If you get the school, the culture of improvement working for it, that's the key. And the third thing, of course, is demographic. And it's very interesting for someone like me who's been working in London since 1964. The Bangladeshi community that came dispossessed, uneducated, in great threat and disturbance, living in appalling conditions in East London, were seen as a problem by many schools in the 60s and 70s. Today, they're seen as a great asset. So the demography has completely changed. Those immigrant groups are now the leaders in many cases in learning, doing superbly well with all the family background and the family support, etc. there. And on the other side, of course, it is fair to say that some poor families have been pushed out of London as well. Poor, white, working-class families not doing well in schools, they've gone, and the others have come in. So a mixture of those three factors, I think.
Very interesting, yeah.
I mean, I would agree with what's been said. Inspirational leadership, a belief that things could get better, and that followed up with money. I think something that hasn't been mentioned so far is the time it has taken. It wasn't, let's try this for a year, and then if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. You know, the people stuck with it over a number of years, and I think that is really important. And I think the point that Alison made too about a collaborative environment where people were engaged in a collective endeavour to make things better, but not finger-wagging at each other. I think these were important things, Sean.
Okay. Right. Some more questions. I think we had one here and then we'll come there.
good research questions. So giving you limitless money, limitless resources, what do you think is the key, perhaps one each, the key question that ought to be addressed in educational research?
Pamela.
Oh, thank you for this. I would say an enduring question is, what can schools do to decrease inequality in educational achievement, broadly conceived?
Right. Okay. Yeah. Who'd like to?
I'm still thinking.
Okay. Well, I think something that I know Alison is very keen on, pupil grouping. That seems to me to be a really under-researched area. On the one hand, you have secretaries of state who are considering making it mandatory to stream or to set. On the other hand, you have the old traditions of mixed ability teaching, which many teachers found incredibly demanding and difficult. But between that, there is a host of different ways that we ought to be doing research into, and as educational researchers, we could be helping the profession enormously by carrying out carefully controlled, well thought through, adequate studies.
Right, yeah.
Okay,
come up with something?
I haven't formulated a question, sorry, but I do think that the thing I'm enduringly fascinated by is how we enable children to genuinely engage in the learning process. what can we do in classrooms that means that if there are 30 children and a teacher, there are 31 learners altogether rather than one teacher and 30 recipients, if you like. So something about how we genuinely engage children and young people in the learning process for themselves so that they're intrinsically motivated. If we could just sort that, that'd be great.
I just wondered actually if we could sort of flip the question over as well and sort of look back on, you know, the BERA's history of the last 40 years. If anybody could highlight any particular thing that we've learned over the last 40 years in education research that's been particularly profound. Again, I'll start with Peter here.
Well, I feel duty-bound to say school effectiveness research, which I've been associated with for 30 years, 35 years, made the argument that schools mattered, that schools could make a difference. And compared to the American research at the time, Jenks and the Coleman report, that were arguing schools made no difference at all, it was a huge step forward. And all credit to Michael Rutter, my first boss, who actually invented the term school effectiveness and began the research. But as I've argued, and Jeff Whitty and I argued in a paper written in this institute, schools can't do it all. There are limits to school effectiveness. And the problem was that governments refused to accept that there were limits and took more or less the argument that if one school could do it, they could all do it, which is manifest nonsense. They can't. And in my book, I describe a head teacher who gets up at 5 o'clock every morning, goes into school, gets home about 10 o'clock every night, works all day Sunday, and runs a great school. But for his family, disaster. You can't run a system like that, and that was the mistake, I think, in politicians in taking the school effectiveness research, taking it too literally, and using it as a weapon on teachers. But I would hope that once that's been sorted out, people could see that underneath there was a kernel of really important where research actually was able to help practice and make the argument that yes, it does matter what happens in the classroom. What any individual teacher does, it does matter, or it can matter greatly for their pupil.
I mean, I would agree with most of that. That's why I said, in answer to your question, more research on narrowing the gap, because the famous Mortimer and Whitty paper did say schools can't do it all. And of course, there was the very famous article, Schools Can't Compensate for Society. So it's been clear, both ourselves and the academy and and for politicians, what it is that schools can do. And I don't think we're there. We know a lot, but we don't know it all. And we know a lot in terms of attainment outcomes. We still don't know a lot in terms of health, for example, general well-being. So I think that's one area. Another area we haven't mentioned is that of special education. And I just think of the work of Baron Cohen on autism and the whole area of child development that I think has taken a great leap forward through the study of atypical child development, and that would be an example I would.
Could I just add, Steve Strand's research, which is coming out at this conference now, is a very important contribution to the debate.
Yeah, it shows the argument is
Yep.
ongoing.
Yep.
Alison, any thoughts?
Yes, I'd like to add to that research around pupil voice, the work of people like Michael Fielding, formative assessment, the actual understanding that children can contribute very meaningfully, do contribute when you give them space to the whole learning arena, rather than assuming that the teacher's got all the answers. Really important.
Okay, thanks very much. We've got about 5 minutes left. I think somebody was here. Yeah, sorry.
Hello, is this working?
Yeah.
Right, my question is about the election manifesto, an election manifesto. A number of us yesterday spent quite a lot of time trying to put together an election manifesto based on social justice for schools and children. I would like to know what are your top 3 in order that you would want to suggest to the political parties for the next election?
Okay, great. If you could keep your answers quite brief, 'cause I will try and get another question in after this, so yeah.
So it's top 3 political priorities.
For the manifestos.
For the manifestos. Well, there must be something about teacher education and only having qualified teachers in schools. That would be one. Another would be, I'm sorry, the hoary question of finance. How to make sure to build on the pupil premium so that schools don't engage in what I would call jiggery-pokery to minimise that in selecting intake, and a different accountability system. Better.
Alison?
Yes, so the first thing I would say is that we should no longer label children or teachers or schools, that we should invest in professional learning, and that we should abolish Ofsted for at least a year while we rethink what kind of accountability system we could put in place that would be meaningful and equitable and worthwhile.
Okay, well, I agree with both of those ideas. I'd like to throw in myself a self-denying ordinance on politicians, actually, in terms of their involving themselves in the day-to-day, micromanaging the education system, a disaster. And they should boldly state, we will not do that. We will create a commission. We will have something like the Law Commission to keep an eye on things, but it won't be party political. Second point is that I would give all schools the same money, the same powers, the same everything, so that it was a level playing field. And thirdly, end league tables.
Do you think you'll ever see a day when the politicians would take that ordinance, as you say?
Like her, I'm an optimist. Otherwise, you're a grumpy old man.
Okay, yes, question here.
I'm just like to direct this question to Alison, if that's all right. I'm just wanting to direct this question to Alison, if that's okay. Sure. Alison, we talked about school effectiveness, and we know from a lot of research that, you know, a prime person in that is the school principal. And in view of your near heart attack, or whatever it is that you did have, I'm wondering who looks after the principals. And that's the question. And there's a second side of it. And it's a suggestion, and I just want you to respond to both, please. I'm wondering if chairs of boards or chairs of councils should have more a role in looking after principals.
Okay, in my case, all the way through my career, and certainly as a head teacher, I have gained courage from feeling I've been standing on the shoulders of giants. So all the way through my career, I have read profusely the work of educationalists. I've listened to researchers. I've been inspired by people like Mary Jane Drummond. You know, I remember when I was a teacher and I was worried about Ofsted coming way back then, Mary Jane said, you only really need to worry about the people that you respect. So, you know, that was that brought me up sharp then, because it made me think, actually, I'd be far more worried if Mary Jane came into my classroom with all her experience of early years than perhaps an Ofsted inspector, because it's about valuing what you hope you do well. So I would say the benefit of academia and educational research is that it helps us to remember much bigger stories of hundreds and thousands of teachers who've tried to do things before us, and we're not actually on our own. And the bit that makes you scared is when you think that you are on your own, particularly as a head teacher. So, and I'm not just saying that because I'm at the IOE this evening and it's a convenient thing to say, it's absolutely the truth. I was thinking as I was coming here, what is it that's made the biggest difference? And it is believing that I'm not on my own because of all of that thinking that's being done and that continues to go on, and communities like this.
What about the chair of board?
The chair of governors, I think governance is an area for development in this country. I think that on a personal level, I have a superb chair of governors at my school. He's the third chair of governors that I've worked with, and they vary considerably in terms of what they can offer. But I don't think there are many chairs of governors that probably have the skill, the time, the capacity to be possibly the person that head teachers have to turn to. I don't know. They may well be in some cases, but I'm not sure that's the only answer that we could come with. I think there's quite a lot of difficulty around governance in some areas. Some areas of the country, it must be very, very hard to find anybody at all to be on your governing body, leave alone someone that's available to listen to you for 3 hours at the end of a long day when things have gone wrong.
This is probably quite a horrible question, but is it potentially a sort of conflict of interest issue as well? If the governor, chair of governors, is meant to be holding you to account, is that his or her role, then you've got that issue as well. That,
Yes, I mean, on my governing body, I'm, again, very fortunate. I have a professional coach mentor from industry who's also a governor. And he is the person that I go and talk to if I'm worried about something directly related to school. And that's a tremendous help to have a coach that you can go and talk to. I just think at a system level, to expect governors to be the solution to head teachers' worries is a big ask, because there's an awful lot of worried head teachers out there. I think the solution is more about reducing so much of the need to worry so much. You know, we shouldn't be at the point of paralysis thinking, oh, well, you know, if I'm dead in the morning, at least I won't have failed. That is ridiculous.
Definitely. Peter, are you going to respond to this question? Who looks after the principals in terms of protecting them from that pressure, and whether the chair of governors should have a role there in terms of supporting them?
Sure. It's a tricky one. I mean, under previous systems, there were two groups that actually helped heads. One were the governing bodies, and I'm a great fan of governing bodies. I've been a governor and I've worked with governors. I've been involved in training governors for many, many years. I think they're terrific. As a volunteer body, our country stands out at having this group of people committed to public service. Fantastic. But they are the critical friends. They were never meant to be the professionals. They were the amateurs. They were the people who cared deeply about the school, but not the professionals. That came through the LEAs, the professional officers there, who were able to supply the detailed legal, financial support, accommodation type information. Now, without them, it's all going to the governing bodies. As Alison says, you might be lucky, you might get suitable people with the skills, you might not. There is a role, therefore, I think, for the heads associations to provide those professional skills. They won't be geographically local, but they can provide the professional skills that heads need. They need that as well as just the governing body.
Okay. Any thoughts, Pamela?
I suppose the only other thing I would add to that is other principals, other head teachers. I don't know if Alison finds this, but certainly in my experience, it can be really very therapeutic and also encourage your own professional development if you've got a buddy head teacher that you can share ideas with. And I know there are groups of head teachers in geographic areas who meet from time to time and seem to enjoy the support they get that way.
Okay. Thanks very much. I think we're just over our time now, so I think we're going to wind up. So thanks very much, everyone. And if you could just thank the audience. Thank you.